and welcome to Driving Force Radio, where we seek to discover what drives today's leaders. On today's show, we are honored to have three fantastic guests with us to talk about true leadership in the face of real issues. Our first guest is Arak Garang. He's one of the original Lost Boys of the Sudan and is now the leader of an NGO called the Seeds of South Sudan. And the beautiful thing about this is he lives here in Denver and really is this great resource for folks to come to on this issue. And we also have Tom and Margaret Melander, who are working with Arak to build Seeds of South Sudan, and they work as missions coordinator at Arvada Covenant Church. Welcome to the show, Arak.
Thank you.
And welcome, Margaret.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
And Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
You know, Arak, your story is so compelling, so I don't want to tell the story. I want you to tell the story for us. Tell us a little bit about how you became a Lost Boy of the Sudan.
Well, first of all, I was born in 1982 in South Sudan in a small village. Life was really good in the village, and I was very happy. I used to play a lot. My mom and my dad were farmers. They keep cows, goats, sheep, all these kind of animals, and life was really good. But in 1989, when I was 7 years old, the war broke out and my village was destroyed. Many people were killed, and at that time I ran to save my life.
So, you know, when you say that you ran to save your life, I mean, there were a lot of families affected by the war in the South Sudan. And talk about that a little bit. I mean, here you are, a 7-year-old little boy, and your family's gone. And your village is gone, and everything you know in life, I mean, is gone. What does that feel like, and what are those steps a 7-year-old takes as they go forward?
Well, actually, it was a very confusing time, but I was trying to do everything I can to keep going.
Yeah, and there were a lot of boys that were in the same situation with you, yes?
Yes.
And you guys journeyed together out of the South Sudan, correct?
Yes.
And what happened then?
What happened is that we left as a group, and at that time we didn't have food to eat, we didn't have any clean water. So what we do along the way was to eat leaf of trees, whatever that was eatable. We also drink dirty water and keep going. One of my cousins actually was very helpful to me. He was 10 years older than me, and he carried some water for me because I was easily get dry out and need more water, but he makes sure that he keeps some water for me until I'm almost dying, and then he will give me a little bit to keep going. Most of the boys die along the way because of lack of water and because of lack of food. Some were also eaten by wild animals, and some eat wild poisonous fruit and die because of that.
Oh, geez. Well, I know that there were 12 to 15,000 of you that were affected by the war in the South Sudan, and you know, you had no food, no clothes, no shoes, and it was a 1,000-mile journey to Ethiopia, and here you are, young boy, a whole lot of young boys who are dying along the way. Talk about that, and talk about the arrival into Ethiopia a little bit.
We arrived in Ethiopia in December of 1989. In Ethiopia, we arrived there and we stayed there for about 2 weeks. And then the United Nations came in and they helped us with medicine, food. And we stayed there for about 18 months. And then another war broke out and we were forced at the gunpoint to go back to Sudan. So during that time, it was the rainy season. We have to cross some rivers, and some of the lost boys get drawn in water, and some were eaten by a crocodile.
So, you know, Arak, this story, I can't even fathom it. And you know, there's been so many stories of violence around the world, and I think people don't understand this. And this story just rings so true even still today. There's war, and it's children and other human beings being affected by war. So you're in Ethiopia for about 18 months, and then they force you at gunpoint to head back to the Sudan. What are you thinking at that point? What does that feel like? What does that look like?
Well, it was a mess, and it was a terrible time for us, because we didn't know actually where we were going and what is going to happen next. So it was kind of worried. We were worried about what will happen next, whether we got killed or something will happen. So it was very confusing, but whatever's happened, we keep going. That was the goal.
And so, you start out with 12,000 to 15,000 young men, and now you're down to however many. I mean, many are gone, and you're 9. And I have a 9-year-old, and I can't imagine what that's like. Is your cousin still with you? Are you on your own at this point? What is that looking like?
Well, my cousin who was helping me got killed in the war in 1994, because he was older than me. And when we left Ethiopia, he joined the army, and he got killed. But I also had others cousins. 2 of them came here with me to U.S.
Okay, so you're headed back to the Sudan, and you follow the border into along Kenya, and it takes you a year to get back. Is that correct?
Yes, it took us a year to go back to go to Kenya because it was during rainy season, and
you're barefoot.
Yes, so sometime. It took us a long time to go from place to place, because the whole area was full of water, and sometime we have to spend a night on tree because there was no place on the ground to sleep or to take rest. So that's why it took us about a year to go to Kenya.
Right. Well, obviously you're a very dedicated man. And I know that you've started the Seeds of South Sudan since then. And Tom, I want to come to you. The Seeds of South Sudan is such a unique organization. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It is. What this is Iraq takes, when he was living in the refugee camp in Kenya called Kakuma, that's when he came to the U.S. And since he's been here, he takes kids that are still there, South Sudanese kids that have basically grown up in the refugee camp, and they're orphans. He takes them out of that school, out of the refugee camp, and gets sponsors for them so that they can be educated in a boarding school in Nakuru, Kenya. And so his ministry is to get these kids sponsored so they can get an education, and then they can go back and rebuild their country.
Yeah, basically, South Sudan is the newest nation in the world, and they became a nation last summer?
Yeah, July 9, 2011.
July 9th, 2011, and there's very little infrastructure in the South Sudan because of all the civil war that's been happening for 2 decades. Mm-hmm. And so Iraq realized that the best way to rebuild the infrastructure of the country would be to educate the children, and then they could go back and they could rebuild from the ground up. And so he's using those children as resources to his brand new nation.
I love that. And Iraq, you're very educated. Talk about that a little bit. I mean, you're educated in Kenya. Talk about how those older kids taught the younger kids and things like that.
Well, at Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, our goal was to get educated, and we help each other. Those who were in grade 3, which was the highest grade, teach those who were in grade 2, and those of us who were in grade 1, get help from grade 2.
And now, one of the most impressive things I think that I know about some of these Sudanese boys who have landed in Denver, one of them has a PhD in mathematics from CU. Iraq is working on his master's in global economics. Wow. And so they have transcended adverse circumstances at the beginning of their life.
Absolutely. And, you know, I know that there aren't many resources often in schools in Africa. And it says, you know, that you guys wrote in dirt with your fingers because there was no writing utensils. And cardboard was the chalkboard with charcoal as the chalk. Yeah. And so there weren't resources, but it didn't mean you couldn't learn.
Yes, our goal was to get educated, so we try to use whatever available resources, using charcoal to write on a carton board and write on the dirt with our fingers.
And one of the most famous sayings in Sudan is, because they're orphaned, education is my mother and my father. So education could give them the advantage that their mother and father were not able to do anymore.
I love that, and I think that's so true.
So we've seen videos of kids who, with a very little that they could take with them, they'd take a book.
Really?
Or a Bible, or things to read.
And carried it those 2,000 miles during the big walk. They had a knapsack with a book in it.
Really? What book did you take, Iraq? Did you take one?
Yes, I was having a grammar book that I got in Ethiopia.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So how did you ultimately end up? I mean, you start in Sudan, you head to Ethiopia, and then you end up in Kenya. How did you end up in Kenya and then end up in Denver?
Well, I ended up in Kenya in 1992 because when the war broke out in Ethiopia, the United Nations told us to go to Kenya because the war was still going on in South Sudan. So we stayed in Kenya for 9 years, and then in 1999, the United Nations told us that they talked to the U.S. government, and the U.S. government accepted us to come to the United States.
And there were 3,800 of you that came from Kenya to the U.S., yes?
Yes.
And how did that go? I mean, do they just pick you up and drop you off somewhere, or how does that work?
Well, they divided us into many groups, and in those many groups there were also subgroups. We were grouped in a group of 5. That means 5 people could stay together and they can help each other. And that's how we didn't know actually where we were going, but we were told that you are going to United States. And
so Iraq was on the 3rd plane load of Sudanese boys.
And these were kids that had never been on a truck, in a car,
right,
much less an airplane.
They loaded them on the plane and took them to the U.S. And also, I've heard some of the Sudanese boys say that the worst day they have had in their life, and keep in mind they had some bad ones, was the day it snowed in Denver.
Really?
Because they thought the coolness could kill them.
Really? Yeah, that was the worst, was the snow?
Yes, it was terrible. I don't know. I'm getting used to it, but
yeah.
I'm still working on it.
So, Tom, talk about it a little bit too. You know, here's Iraq getting on the plane. The United Nations says, yeah, everything's okay. We're going to group them in groups of 5 and put them on a plane. They don't all come to Denver, but Iraq ends up in Denver. Talk about a little bit about that, and you know, sort of that journey for Iraq.
Yeah. So these kids or young men are loaded onto this plane, and they're given airplane food and this new things that they'd never seen before. Iraq was pretty smart. He knows he didn't eat on this airplane trip. Because, you know, he had a tender stomach. But they come over here to the U.S. and the government would actually help him out for 90 days. But this is
only for 90 days.
For 90 days, and then they expect him to be on their own.
And these are boys that have been in and out of refugee camps since they were young,
right?
And really never had I mean, never really known the modern anything.
They have never seen electricity. Yeah. They have never seen a car.
They didn't know how to cross the street and read the stoplights.
They didn't know what a doorknob was. I mean,
and they get 90 days.
90 days of assistance.
Yeah. Wow.
And they figured it out. Yeah. And so that's what impresses me the most. Like I said, these are transcenders.
Yeah.
So they put Iraq and the other kids into a Emily Griffith Opportunity School.
Great school.
And to try to learn English and American ways and things like that. And they work on their GED. And so Iraq, he actually did a lot of studying on his own for his GED, and he passed it. But just the whole Iraq's history of being with the other boys and for survival, they always work together. They're a very strong community, something that we could take notice of.
Well, and I want to ask all three of you this question because I think, you've heard the term Lost Boys of Sudan, but I think a lot of people may not understand what that means. So, Iraq, tell me, what does the Lost Boys of Sudan mean for you?
Well, the Lost Boy of Sudan doesn't mean anything, but it mean a group of boys whose their parents were killed or who lost their parents during war in South Sudan. It was the name given by Pira, praying American, to the Lost Boy when we were in Ethiopia.
Okay.
Now I'm not a lost boy, I'm a young man, but the name is Tira Man, but that's where the name come from.
Okay.
Right. I think it's a little bit of a misnomer because they really aren't lost anymore. They have found their way and
it doesn't sound like they were ever lost. I mean, they were lost from their country.
Yes.
They were so tied together.
And I've heard somebody say they were lost in time, really, because they had such a long, long journey.
Right.
And so they were lost in that sense, but no more. They're doing great things. They've overcome and they're doing great things, I think.
Yeah. So, Iraq, I have to come back to you. So, Tom was just saying, you land here in Denver. You're clearly not accustomed to the cold and the snow here. But I have to ask you, what was like when you first got here? What are those first things that you experienced, and what was that like?
Well, my first experience, the difficult part was that whenever I was in car, I vomit.
Car sick.
That took about 6 months, and I was taken to many different doctors and given different kind of medicine. But it didn't work until I started driving myself.
Gotcha.
So there were so many things that were confusing, how it's like going to the supermarket. I easily get lost.
And crossing the
street. Because it was so big, crossing the street. Yeah, it was like learning again.
Yeah.
One of our favorite stories that Iraq tells is first time he and a few of his friends went out to lunch. Tell them about that experience, Iraq.
Yeah, what happened when we first get here, we stayed for about a month, and we were given some money by agency, to buy few stuff. And one time we decided to go and eat at an American restaurant. So there was a Burger King close to our apartment. So we went there, we didn't know what to order, and we were asked, what do you want? And we say, we want to eat. And then they said, did you want to eat cheeseburger? And then we say, yes. And, they show us a big picture of cheeseburger. And when they bring our order back, we say, no, we order the big one, not the small one.
That's great. Yeah. So what else? What was the most shocking thing about being you've come from Kenya, you've come from all of having nothing to a city that's bustling. What else? What else was those big shocks for you? Burger King, crossing the street, cars.
You didn't eat hot dogs because you were afraid it was dog.
Yes. There were so many things that were confusing at the time. American food was very different.
Sure.
And culture shock was very, very, because America is very different from where I came from. I grew up in a small village where everybody know each other, and it was easy to go around. But here in America, being on the bus and you don't know where to get out, it was very confusing.
Sure.
In many different sons.
Sure. So you get here and you enroll over at the Emily Griffith School. How did you get educated here? Because I'm imagining education here, even in its, most base form, is very different than it is from where you came from. Talk about how you got educated here in the U.S., Iraq.
First of all, when I first get here, the first school that I went to is Emily Griffith. At Emily Griffith, we were taught English as a second language and how to express yourself in English. So that was good, and I was there for about 1 month. And then after that, I went on my own to study a GED.
Oh, wow.
And then I take a test, and I passed it. And that was the time that I started going to Denver Community College. I stayed in Denver Community College for 2 years, and then I went to CU. CU Denver.
And now you're working on your Master's of Economics?
Yes.
And where are you doing that at?
At CU Denver.
At CU Denver as well. Wow. That's amazing. What do you want to do with that master's degree?
I want to go back to Africa and help with international development.
Wow.
And that's my goal, to help build communities.
Sure.
Yes.
Sure. So, Tom and Margaret, how did you guys get engaged with Iraq?
Well, a couple of years ago, I'm the missions coordinator at my church. And Stacy Agers, our director of children's ministries, came and told me that she was wanting some ideas for their vacation Bible school. And just about a month previous, I ran into an old friend, Tamara Buchan, who was telling me about Iraq and his ministry and that about the Lost Boys and just educating these kids and everything like that. So I approached Stacy with that option along with several others, and immediately she just jumped on working with the Lost Boys. And so we took that on, but it was just hard to understand Iraq's story and talking about Kenya, talking about South Sudan, all these kinds of things.
Right.
So Margaret and I, our daughter Kelsey, happened to be working in Kampala, Uganda for the University of Colorado doing AIDS research at the time.
Oh.
And so we were going to go out and visit her. And so we thought, well, since we're in the neighborhood, we'll run over to Kenya and go check out this school that Iraq was telling us about, Roots Academy. And so we flew into Nairobi, and we were able to get up to Nakuru. And we stayed in a motel, a Western motel there, which they had a little bit of trouble finding, but they found us one. And the night before, we met 4 other Lost Boys. And that was just a great experience. One of the kids was 3 years old, even younger than Iraq when he was a Lost Boy. But we had dinner with them that night, and then the next morning we went off to the school and got to meet the kids that Iraq is supporting. And, the kids were amazing. The school was amazing. It's actually in the British education system, so there's 12 grades. The headmaster or headmistress, the lady who runs the school, she gave us a tour, taking all the classes.
Right.
Margaret can tell you about the first class that we went to. That was really interesting.
Well, it was they called it the baby class, and there were 3 and 4-year-olds, and 3 and 4-year-olds were writing complete sentences in a notebook with proper punctuation, grammar, capitalization. Wow. And we were just impressed, and we got letters from those kids afterwards, and we were hooked.
Yeah, these 3 and 4-year-old kids were doing subtraction math.
But the Sudanese people that we have met help themselves, and they're just the kind of people that you want to give a handout to.
Right.
A hand up.
A hand up to.
A hand up to.
And it sounds like, Iraq's obviously since the time he was 7, been on this journey, been on this path of discovery and of success, and is well on his way. And then, to have you all and the folks that support the work that he's doing and helping him get through this part of his journey, so that hopefully he can go back and build that infrastructure of South Sudan and the country that he loves and that is home for him, are absolutely fantastic. And, as you said, Margaret, it's a story about transcendence and a story about leadership in a way that many don't think of. It's not about running a Fortune 500 organization, but it's about the human being transcending and becoming this amazing leader for themselves, for their cities, and for their homeland. And when we come back, we'll have more with Iraq, as well as you, Margaret, and Tom, and we'll talk more about Roots Academy and what the organization is doing now. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.